Good morning, everyone. It got incredibly quiet. Thank you. And thank you all for coming to the Wilson Center today. It is a packed house, so thank you for that. And also to the many that are watching online because we're streaming, we want to thank you as well. I forget what the number of RSVPs was, but it was in the hundreds. So we obviously have a topic here that is of importance to so many of us. So I want to thank you for coming. My name is Mike Sfrega. I'm the director of the Global Risk and Resilience Program and our Polar Institute. So it is an honor to have you all here at the Wilson Center. This convening is just a part of our DNA as the nation's think tank. It's really what we do on a very robust level, but it's not just convening of Wilson Center scholars. It's policymakers, researchers, practitioners, and the private sector to craft, inform, and advance solutions of global risk. Boy, if there was ever an issue that we needed to collectively address, it's the issue that we will discuss today. So thank you for participating in this. I think you'll have a wonderful panel. We also want to make it interactive, so please have your questions ready and your issues to discuss. We want to thank our co-conveners, USAID, Circulate Capital, and Ocean Conservancy for helping us bring all of you together and this topic to light. And we want to thank our Wilson Center co-sponsors, the Science and Technology Innovative Program, our Asia Program, and our China Environment Forum. Obviously, there are reasons why those programs are heavily vested in this issue. Today, I get to introduce our introductory presenter, Chris Milligan. Many of you know Chris, but let me just abbreviate his long and distinguished career. He serves as counselor to the USAID. He's a member of the Senior Foreign Service. He previously served as the acting mission director of USAID Madagascar from 2012 to 2016 as USAID's first mission director to Burma in 24 years. He integrated assistance with diplomatic efforts to advance Burma's historic reforms. Chris also directed institutional reforms that revamped state and USAID strategies and processes and improved the effectiveness of foreign assistance while serving as a senior development advisor for the first quadrennial diplomatic and development review. And he also served as Deputy Assistant Administrator in USAID's Bureau of Policy, Planning, and Learning. Finally, let me highlight this. Chris also deployed to Haiti as the U.S. response coordinator overseeing $1 billion in U.S. relief efforts following the January 2010 earthquake. He has been posted to overseas missions in Indonesia, Zimbabwe, and Ecuador, and served as Deputy Mission Director in Iraq. Please welcome to the podium, Chris Milligan. Chris?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Mike, for that warm introduction and also for hosting us here today at the Wilson Center. I would also like to recognize representatives from Circulate Capital, Ocean Conservancy, and of course our corporate partners, Procter Gamble, Dow, Unilever, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and Danone. I feel very fortunate to be here today on a matter of such great importance, particularly because this Saturday we will connect with others around the world across our blue planet to celebrate and protect our shared oceans on World Oceans Day. You know our oceans feed us. You know they shelter us by regulating our climate. And they generate most of the oxygen we breathe. But today they, and therefore we, face a serious problem: ocean plastic pollution. And we are here today not just because this is a problem, but because we need to be part of the solution. This is not something, though, that a government or any government can solve on its own. It's too big, it's too complicated, it's too complex. But that doesn't mean we sit back. It doesn't mean that we're overwhelmed, paralyzed by inaction. No, tackling the world's greatest challenges requires leadership, innovation, and partnership. True partnership where each organization brings its comparative advantage to the solution. This is at the heart of what we're doing at USAID when we talk about private sector engagement. We know that sound development requires market-based solutions driven by private enterprise. At USAID, we partner with countries on their journeys to self-reliance. And to do so, we bring our ability to mobilize and catalyze private capital and de-risk investment. It is in the private sector, as you know, where you find the capital, the expertise, and the innovation, and the scale for solutions to 21st century problems. Ocean plastic waste is one of those challenging 21st century problems. Marine debris touches every corner of our oceans. There are now 5 massive patches of floating garbage in the world's oceans. We found microplastics in the Arctic sea ice, at the most remote stretches of islands in the Pacific, and in the deepest ocean trenches. Thanks to pioneering research by Professor Jenna Jambak of the University of Georgia, we know that most ocean plastic emanates from land-based sources. An enormous amount comes from cities in the developing world, which cannot adequately manage their waste. And this includes a number of cities in the rapidly urbanizing countries of South and Southeast Asia. Dr. Jambak estimates that 8 million metric tons of plastic pour into the oceans every year. That's the equivalent of one garbage truck every minute dumping its waste. And it's a chilling graphic if you think about it. At this rate, by 2050, there would be more plastic by weight in our oceans than there would be fish. Not only is this an existential threat to marine ecosystems, to fisheries and aquaculture, to pest and disease control, to tourism and recreation, but it is a huge threat to our own health and well-being. Ocean plastic waste is a global problem, but waste management is a local issue. Solutions must involve strengthening local infrastructure, local processes, local organizations, and governance. To fully succeed, local solutions need to rely on private enterprise. As we strengthen private enterprise and bring investors to the table, we at USAID offer countries a sustainable model of development. Our model, it builds a country's self-reliance. It grows its private sector, encourages them to use their own resources in water, land, and clean air for their long-term growth. Others, however, present a different model, where countries mortgage their natural resources to pay off predatory debt, or where environmental safeguards are largely ignored, as is the well-being of vulnerable populations and the principles of economic inclusive growth. Our agenda is different. Our goal is to promote a partner's self-reliance so they can participate in the world economy as equals and join us in addressing global challenges. We've already begun on working the problem of ocean plastic pollution, particularly in 4 key countries: Indonesia, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam. We are engaging these countries as well through the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy to help improve their management of natural resources. Our municipal waste recycling program is partnering with local organizations and the private sector in these countries to improve waste management and strengthen recycling systems. We're working to build consensus on policies to incentivize the collection of low-value plastics and to help independent waste collectors, especially women, develop the marketing skills they need to operate successfully. The recent bipartisan passage of the Save Our Seas Act and the hopefully forthcoming Save Our Seas Act 2.0 demonstrate America's commitment to cleaning up the world's oceans. But as I said earlier, USAID can only be part of the solution, which is why I am very pleased to be able to announce that USAID has finalized a blended finance agreement with Circulate Capital. This agreement will leverage private sector financing and expertise to address ocean plastic pollution. USAID will provide Circulate Capital with a $35 million, 50% loan portfolio guarantee through our Development Credit Authority to incentivize private capital investment and new business development in the recycling value chains of targeted countries. Circulate Capital's investment strategy, in turn, will leverage more than $100 million in private sector capital to support companies and infrastructure projects that reduce the amount of municipal waste and that is disposed of improperly. This agreement is backed by investments from some of the world's leading companies like those here today. We are very proud to be a partner in this innovative partnership that underscores really what we mean about private sector engagement. Now, we have a very distinguished panel of experts here to discuss all of this in more detail, as well as provide their insights and their expertise on broader strategies and opportunities for tackling the problem of ocean plastic. So I'm looking forward to hearing their contributions. Thank you again to all of you for being here today, because your presence and your questions and your participation really focuses attention on this issue and on the importance of engagement, partnerships, and innovative solutions to one of the world's pressing problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Perfect foundation for the discussion this morning. So it's a pleasure to introduce the moderator of this panel, Ambassador David Bolton. Dave currently serves as a senior fellow in our Polar Institute. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans and Fisheries in the Department of State, attaining the rank of ambassador in 2006. A little bit about Dave. He coordinated U.S. foreign policy concerning oceans and fisheries, as well as issues relating to the Arctic and Antarctica, and oversaw U.S. participation in international organizations dealing with these issues. Ambassador Bolton served as the lead U.S. negotiator on a wide range of agreements and chaired numerous international meetings related to those issues. During the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council, he served as the chair of the senior Arctic officials. He also co-chaired Arctic Council task forces that produced the 2011 Arctic Search and Rescue Agreement and the 2011 Arctic Oil Pollution Agreement. He separately chaired negotiations to produce an Arctic Fisheries Agreement. Please welcome to the podium our friend and colleague, Ambassador Dave Bolton.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much, Mike. I spent most of my career at the State Department working on ocean issues, but the issue of ocean plastic was not high on the radar screen early on. I'm talking about the early 90s when I first started working on ocean issues. But it soon did come to our attention. And indeed, toward the end of my time there, when Secretary of State Kerry launched a series of conferences, the Our Ocean conferences, ocean pollution and plastic pollution in particular became a main focus. And indeed, some of the people on the panel today and the organizations they represent were very much involved in those conferences, which continue. Indeed, there will be yet another Our Ocean conference in Norway later this year, and Palau year after that, and I believe Panama after that. As Chris Milligan said, it is a difficult, though not intractable problem. Through the types of partnerships being launched now, I think we do have the chance to remediate at least a portion of this, but it will take a lot of hard work and innovation. And I'm happy to listen to a panel of experts we have with us today that can help elucidate some of these possibilities. So you have their bios with you, but I thought I might just introduce them very briefly, and then we're tell you a little bit about the format for our discussion today. To my immediate left, my friend Emily Woglam, Executive Vice President of Ocean Conservancy. Next is Rob Kaplan, one of those people who participated in one of the Our Ocean conferences. He is the founder and CEO of Circulate Capital. Next, Carrie Thompson, another friend from the USAID. She is the Acting Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and Environment. Next comes Haley Lowry. She is the Global Sustainability and End-Use Marketing Director at Dow. And finally, last but not least, Steve Sikra, Associate Director, Research and Development, Global Product Stewardship, Procter Gamble. We're not going to have individual presentations the way we often do here at the Wilson Center and elsewhere. We're going to have a kind of moderated discussion. My role is to ask some open-ended questions and give the panelists a chance to tell you what they know and think. And then we will open up the conversation to you. So as Mike said, please have questions at the ready, and we look forward to those as well. Emily, I wonder if I could start with you.
Great.
So Chris Milligan provided a kind of high-level perspective of this issue of ocean plastics. He brought to us some rather shocking statistics, but also, I think, inspired us to wrap our minds around this and continue good work that has already started. I'm wondering if you might... Thank you, Lauren. How's my tie? Is it straight?
It's great with the fish.
None of us would be here today without Lauren Racy. I'm wondering if you could help us dive a little deeper into the problem. How big of an issue is this, and what are the impacts that Ocean Conservancy sees?
Yeah, sure, great. So just to start, a little background. Ocean Conservancy has been working on this issue for over 30 years. And where we started was to organize volunteers, millions of volunteers around the world that participate every September in the International Coastal Cleanup. And over those more than 30 years, they've removed some 300 million pounds of trash from the beaches, which was a stunning amount in and of itself. We know that it was that amount because in addition to cleaning the beaches, we also ask our volunteers to collect data on what they're finding.
They have an app now for that, right?
Yes, Clean Swell. It's a great app. You can all download it. And that sort of the reason I mention that is because it speaks to the way in which we want to approach issues, which is to sort of be data-driven and understand the nature of the problem. And so in 2011, we started talking with folks, including some of our partners in this room, about how do we actually get at some of the solutions here, and started by saying, you know, we have very little information about how much trash is actually in the ocean, where it comes from, all the rest of that. It seems unthinkable now. This is such a sort of common issue that people talk about. People seem to have a real awareness. But back in 2011, we didn't really even know some of the basics. And so one of the first things we did was actually pull together that research team that Chris quoted that led to the Jambeck study to figure out just how much plastic there was. And so you heard, Chris gave the numbers, right? 8 million metric tons. To be honest with you, that's a pretty crude estimate. It was intended only as sort of an initial baseline, but it helps give us a good perspective on just what we're talking about, right? That one garbage truck per minute. That same research group is continuing to look at a lot of the other sources of plastic into the ocean. For example, I think there's growing concern about lost and abandoned fishing gear. That's particularly harmful to marine animals. But overall, we now understand that plastic is nearly ubiquitous in the ocean, right? As Chris mentioned, it is in the deepest Marianas Trench. It is in the Arctic sea ice. It's also impacting the animals. It is in the stomachs of the largest blue whales, and it is in microplastics are in the smallest plankton, right? So it's really across the entire scale. Overall, research suggests that over 800 species of marine animals have been impacted by marine debris, either by being entangled in it or ingesting it. And in fact, there's still a lot of research going on to figure out what that means and where that plastic ends up. But for example, one study showed that over 25% of fish that you actually pull from the market shelf has plastic in the guts of the fish itself. So that's fish being sold for sort of human consumption.
And hence in us.
Well, it gets a little bit more complicated. Most people don't eat the stomach contents of the fish, but certainly when you talk about mollusks and other bivalves, and a lot of the places we're seeing microplastics in drinking water and beer and salt, it's certainly something that we need to pay attention to. So huge distribution of plastic, lots of impacts on marine species and marine life. That's our primary concern. But I would also note that there's a tremendous economic impact to marine debris. I think there was a 2009 study from the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation that showed that in the previous year, the economic impact of marine debris totaled $1.3 billion, right? From impacts to tourism, costs of cleaning things up. There's been a more recent study that looked worldwide and put the estimate of cost at about $2.5 trillion annually. So this is important not just from an economic standpoint, or not just from a wildlife standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint.
Thanks very much. I'll come back to you in a moment, but I'd like to turn to Rob, if I may. So the what Chris Milligan described as a partnership now involves blended finance. I had not heard that term before getting ready for this. I'm wondering if you can help us understand what that really is, and what is new and creative about this. Why do you think this is a particularly good model for this issue?
Yeah. So blended finance is a concept where you're bringing together capital from the private sector and the public sector to create greater impact than you would with any individual source of capital. And you're doing it in a way that can leverage the goals and the requirements of a public sector, which is often concessionary or below market, but also requiring more development goals associated with those impacts. Whereas the private sector needs a different kind of return. As we've looked at how do you invest in the solutions that will prevent plastic pollution in some of these target markets, we've seen that there's an incredible need for capital, well beyond the $100 million that we've been able to pull together in partnership with some of the folks on this stage, but as well as with USAID. The pathway is to really unlock and catalyze billions of dollars of investment into Asian infrastructure and across the emerging markets. And that infrastructure today, those dollars are being allocated towards bridges and roads and ports. And what we need to do is help those institutional investors understand that allocating capital to waste and recycling is critical to their opportunities as well and can meet their requirements. The partnership that we're here to talk about today and blended finance is a way to accelerate and catalyze that kind of investment.
I see. So what are some examples of the types of projects that should be invested in through this partnership?
Well, one of the unique things about how this thing came together was we've been working with the USAID team for a couple years now, as well as Ocean Conservancy. And there's been a lot of great research that found that by investing in integrated waste management in these high leakage markets, we can make a big dent in the amount of plastic that's flowing into the environment and ultimately the ocean. And in often cases, that is the fundamentals of collecting waste, sorting waste, processing, manufacturing. And so we're investing in companies and projects that are creating economic development opportunities in these countries using waste as, instead of just a cost, both an environmental cost and an economic cost, like Emily talked about, but a resource for economic development and manufacturing.
Okay. Carrie, I don't know if you know, but back in the mists of time, I actually worked at USAID.
Did you really? I didn't know that.
1984, 85.
Before my time.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out.
Just before my time.
And I think it's fair to say that, as with state, USAID probably did not have this issue so much on its radar screen then either, but it is now. Why? Why, from a USAID perspective, beyond what Chris has already told us, is marine plastic pollution become a focal point?
Thanks very much, Dave. Marine plastic pollution is a huge problem, as Chris well laid out. It has all sorts of knock-on development effects. Emily noted the impacts on fisheries and tourism, so it's a livelihoods impact. It has a food security impact. It affects the fish's livelihood, its reproduction. It has other potential health impacts. For example, plastic waste on beaches can be breeding grounds for dengue and Zika mosquitoes. And so there are all sorts of development challenges that flow from the gigantic problem of ocean waste. And just to follow on to what Rob was talking about, this kind of partnership with the private sector is critical to us. As Chris well said, this problem is so big and it has so many associated development problems, and the resources required to address it are such that no government can go it alone on this. Certainly not a development agency like ourselves. We know well, those of us who have been in the business over the last decades, the percentage that official development assistance represents as a total of the capital flowing into developing countries has shrunk over time to less than 10%. So we are a small player, so we see our role as catalysts to help facilitate and support transformative solutions to problems like this. Our partnership with Circulate Capital is a really great solution. The partial loan guarantee is designed to catalyze private capital in waste management and recycling in developing markets because it offers protection to investors by lowering their perceived downside, and we hope the real, downside risks of loss, making their investment in Circulate Capital's investment more attractive. We need to continue to work with private sector for so many reasons on topics like this. Beyond the finance it can bring, private sector is involved in all stages of waste management, from generation, collection, processing, and so they are a key stakeholder to this conversation. We work closely also because we know that private sector and many of the groups that are here today are a major source of innovation and expertise in emerging technologies. This is a really exciting moment to see. We're all taking a look at, the corporations are taking a look at in material science, the different packaging materials and how we might evolve them. So we are looking to engage that expertise. And we think we bring something as well as government. You wanted to ask something further?
I did. I was curious as you were speaking, in your experience, what kind of receptivity is there in the developing states where the problem is most acute? Are you finding eager partners there in the governments and other entities?
Yeah. I think perhaps an initial concern we might have had is we focused our resources. We've been engaged in this for past several years, not for a very long time. It has been an emerging issue. Congress has appropriated funds particularly for this purpose. They care. Certainly they've passed legislation. And so we figured the most strategic way for us to go about this is to look where the problem is greatest. We know through Jenna Jambak's research that it is land-based poor waste management that results in the marine debris. And so we focused on those places, and they all happen to be in Asia that were 4 of the top 5 contributing countries. And some concern that we may look like we're signaling them out as bad actors, but I think working at the local level, our assistance is welcomed. So it really has been well received.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll come back to you in a bit, but now I'd like to turn to members of our panel from private sector. Both Haley and Steve, you come from companies that probably back when I was starting my career also did not focus very much on a problem like this, but now you're in. Why? What's in it for you?
Yeah, so I'll start first. So
Please.
Thank you so much. So Dow is, for those who may not be familiar, Dow is a leading material science company in the industry. And for us, we have been involved with Ocean Conservancy over the past several years. But like Emily mentioned before, it started with beach cleanups and getting our employees actively engaged and involved in this issue. But I almost look at it as not a waste, it's a resource. And so if companies start to look at it as a resource, it can be used for the circular economy. And so advancing our principles on the circular economy is something that is absolutely critical to our company. From designing materials that allow packaging to be more recyclable, to creating new business models, to new collection systems or schemes that may need to be come up with. And I also fully believe that, to echo a few of the comments earlier made, this is not something that any one of us can do alone. It's not something that the private sector can do alone either. It will take policy, it will take government support, it will take NGO involvement and true understanding and localized solutions to address the issue.
Okay, thank you. Steve.
So thank you. What I'll add to that is at Procter Gamble, we're privileged to serve 5 billion consumers every day. And our consumers tell us very clearly that helping them with sustainable solutions is our job. We know consumers want to recycle, but they look to us to, number one, use less plastic. So we have commitments to do that. And in fact, by 2030, we've committed to reduce our virgin plastic petroleum by 50%. And we know that reduction is a critical component to this effort to eliminate plastic waste in the environment. We're also focused on recycling. Not many people may be aware that we've been using recycled content plastic in our packaging for 30 years. But that's not enough. So we made commitments to double that. And coupled with our reduction of 50%, you should read into that an inclusion of more recycled content, and particularly more post-consumer recycled content, because we want to encourage consumers to recycle. We also know that design of packaging is incumbent upon us. So in our design, we focus on 100% recyclability. And let me just define recyclability, because for us to declare a package as recyclable, we need to know that there's a collection system that will take it, that there's a mechanism to sort it and process it, and most importantly, there's a demand pull. So we need to see a market for this, and we see Procter & Gamble as having a major role in that, as well as others. And as we embark on these journeys, the discussion on plastics in the ocean and plastic in the environment has certainly come to the forefront more so. So we've made a goal, and that goal is by 2030, that we want to identify solutions so no P&G plastic enters the ocean.
Excellent.
We think it's important that you stop the flow into the ocean such that we can really get a handle on the problem. Now,
I've heard it said that if you walked into a bathroom and the tub was overflowing, you wouldn't start by mopping up. You'd start by turning off the tap.
Yeah.
That's right. That's a great analogy. And that's what we think the solutions are multiple. Number one, start with reduce. Number two, build out your infrastructure. Make sure that you can stop the flow going in. And most importantly, ensure there's a demand pull, a use for the material once it's collected. And let me just close by saying that no one company can do this alone, right? We need to work in partnership with others, in partnership with Ocean Conservancy, with Circulate Capital, with USAID, with Dow as partners, and with others across the entire value chain. And it takes a combination of goals and resources and commitment, but most importantly, enduring partnership. And so dollars is critical. It's one component of this. I just want to add one more word, if I can, to blended finance. I'm an engineer. I like to describe things a little bit simply. I like the term catalytic capital. So if we put $1 in place and we give it away, it's a grant. If that entices somebody else to add another $1, then we've doubled that money. That catalyzed that. If we put money in loans in a second position, we have others coming in taking first position, and we multiply the impact of this. So that catalytic capital, built with an intent to demonstrate an investable runway, really unlocks the solutions, particularly in South and Southeast Asia, where we know infrastructure is needed and funding is required to get there.
Thanks very much. Haley said something that was intriguing to me, and it's something I've heard about before but don't actually know very much about. Are we getting closer either to finding true substitutes for plastic for many of its uses, materials that either do completely biodegrade or otherwise are less harmful if they were to enter the ocean, or to developing a type of plastic that actually does completely biodegrade? Or what kind of progress are we making toward those ends?
Yeah, so I mean, if we take a look back at plastics in general, it has been a material of choice for many decades, and the reasons are for the lightweight ability, all of the benefits that we've seen as to why it's used. So I mean, we fully believe that it should not go into the environment. So that has to be the case. So at Dow, we're focused a lot on recyclability and getting the material back that's being used to be used again and again. Yeah. So one of the new technologies that is starting to emerge is advanced recycling technologies, where you can actually take this any type of plastic and convert that back to a feedstock source that can be used over and over again, which is infinitely recyclable. So those are the types of solutions that we as a company are really looking into. Absolutely, biodegradability, the bioplastics, those are topics that we are addressing and looking into. I would say there's not one silver bullet solution out there today. And we're really trying to find out, through research and science and technology, what are the best decisions and the material choices for those applications that still require the performance benefits needed to keep your food fresh, to feed more people, to ensure this food and the safety of the product. So all of those factors have to be combined into making the ultimate decision of what material of choice is used.
Okay. So a number of you, starting with Carrie, mentioned something that I've also heard a number of times, and that is a significant percentage of the plastic entering the ocean comes from the land territories of a relatively small number of states, primarily in Asia. Does it make sense to focus on that part of the world to the exclusion of other places? How do we balance between working in that part of the world with other places where the problem is also pretty acute? I'm not sure who that question's to. Anybody who has a view on that?
I mean, I might just say that I think we need to work first where it is most immediately an urgent problem. And that's why we have started with a focus on Asia. I think certainly there are plenty of other regions that have this similar issue, and we would like to work as well, but that is why we chose to start with the 4 countries that Chris mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, so I guess I would add, I think this is one of the things we all struggle with, right? Is
Right.
the magnitude of this problem is so enormous that we sort of have to do everything, right? We have to reduce, we have to redesign things, we have to create demand for recycled content, we have to put basic infrastructure for collection in place, and we have to do it everywhere, and we have to do all it now. So how do you balance that with the sense that you have to start somewhere?
Yes.
And you have to start with a particular focus. So I would remind us that the Jambeck paper came out 4 years ago. So we're 4 years into this. I also think that it is interesting to think about the different roles that the different geographies can play in the solution. So in a lot of the countries that Circulate Capital and that we focused our research on and where some of this action is, we're focusing on the places where that lack of the basic collection, the lack of the basic infrastructure is sort of a key priority because that's what enables a whole bunch of other follow-on effects that could actually move towards a circular economy. But in other parts of the world, like here at home or in other developed nations, we may be in a better position to work on some other parts of the solution in terms of innovation in materials, fixing sort of the broken recycling process and recycling system, figuring out how to create policies and incentives that help support the actual collection and sort of economics of recycling. So I think it may be that we just think about this as it's sort of a different set of solutions in the different geographies. And in the places that we're talking about in Circulate Capital and some of the other places, it's that just sort of like the basic starting point of you need some infrastructure to be able to recover some of this material that's being put out in the world.
Okay. Rob, back to you. You'd mentioned earlier that you were hoping that the investments that are part of this partnership as it exists now will catalyze billions from others. From whom? What are the sources? How do you attract that level of interest beyond what we have today?
Yeah. So we've spent the last couple of years looking at who's investing in this sector in these countries, where those investment opportunities are today, what types of capital they need, and where it's headed. And one of the things that's pretty clear is that pretty much nobody is investing, whether it's public or private sector. So, that's one of the reasons why no one's investing is because no one else is doing it. And someone has to take on that first risk. And it's not going to be an institutional investor or a pension fund or an infrastructure fund or a sovereign wealth fund that has a very clear set of returns and wealth management that they're targets that they're trying to achieve. So the first step is building that first fund and building a track record and showing that there is a way to generate market rate returns. And right now we're doing that by leveraging our capital from the corporations and the private sector as well as USAID. But ultimately, we need to see those other investors coming in. They get active when they see other people making money.
Right.
So you need to show that there's a track record there. And they also need to see more funds. One of the big challenges is like the scale of capital at those large billion-dollar size management companies or management funds is like they can't do a transaction for less than $500 million. So you need to start aggregating lots of smaller opportunities up, and there needs to be funds like us and many others, as well as funds of funds and larger private equity funds that can start to build different forms of capital available that allow the larger institutional players to participate.
Thank you. How do each of you regard some of the other players in this space? The philanthropies who have gotten involved in ocean conservation, some of whom are making ocean plastic one of their key issues, or the international financial institutions, some of whom, the World Bank and others, are also playing in this space. Do you regard them as potential partners, as competitors? Are you worried about working across purposes? Is there possibility for synergy? I'm not entirely sure who I'm asking here. Yeah. You may each have different perspectives on these things. Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, let me just start by saying there's room for everybody here.
Yeah, that's it.
You know, we all share one ocean. And so we all need to be part of the collective solution. And unless we collaborate with everybody across the entire value chain, we won't make a dent in this. The good news is we view plastic as having value, and we want it back. That starts to provide some of the catalyst for this investment. And when we work together, particularly pre-competitively, across the entire value chain, we can bring the full resources of all of our institutions together and really bring this solution to the forefront.
Other thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Other types of partners, are they out there?
I would just say I think some of it comes back to thinking about the different role that each of those partners can play. I think this is a great example, right, of where the private sector and where USAID have been able to figure out how their separate roles come together. I think when we look, the same is true of philanthropy, of other nonprofits, right? Our role was to try and help initiate some of this. A lot of where this sort of theory of this project came from was some reports we did.
Yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about Stemming the Tide?
Well, so the thing is, so we did these two reports, Stemming the Tide and then The Next Wave. And, you know, when we sometimes talk to philanthropists and funders and say, we want to do a report, they're like, oh God, really, a report? But the point was not the report. The point was that we got a lot of our corporate partners, a lot of the initial funders of Circulate Capital, folks like Steve, folks like Haley, to work with us in the steering committee of this report to really dig down into that information that Jenna had put out, Jenna Jambeck, around waste management being a challenge, and to ask the question of like, okay, waste management's not new. This is not, we don't need some miracle innovation to know how to collect trash up off the streets. Why isn't it happening? Right, which led to some of these observations about the lack of investment in this space, which then led to these conversations about, okay, well, what's the role? Why is that lack of investment? What's the role that the private sector could play in sort of changing some of that? And we dragged Rob in from his previous position to help us work on that, with the idea of that you create this sort of common set of facts and common buy-in to an understanding of here's what some of these situations are, and then, you know, curate that conversation about what do we do about it. So I think that it's just a great example of how sort of collaboration, even just on a basic understanding of what the facts are and what the issues are, can really lead to and inspire other people to come in and play the role that they need to play and that they're best suited to play. And that was sort of our job, was to create that conversation.
Right.
And it's great to see it actually moving forward.
I would just say quickly that, building on both of those comments, that the scale is so different from working locally with small coastal communities, small towns, villages, cities, to the national level, to the global scale. And I as somebody said, everybody, all these different institutions have their particular niche and the role that they are particularly well prepared to play. USAID, for example, is able to provide through programs we have through our municipal waste recycling program that we've been implementing for the past few years in those Asian countries that we've mentioned, small grants to entrepreneurs who are working at the local level, very micro solutions that is below the radar screen that Circulate Capital will be doing. They will be doing a kind of a next level of enterprises looking at the recycling. And then potentially the multilateral development banks or others could work at more of a national level on bigger infrastructure elements. And so we all have a role to play, I think is the answer.
And the only other thing I would add is, as this issue has gained so much awareness, you have more and more organizations popping up all over the world saying,
Yes.
we need involvement, or we would love funding. And so we get approached all of the time on these things. So yes, absolutely more involvement is good. But part of the reason why we chose this investment in Circulate Capital is because we need localized solutions. This is that you cannot, going back to my comment earlier, you cannot solve this with one bullet. You have to develop and tailor a localized solution that you can actually collect the waste, you can process it, you can sort it, you can get the end market for it that makes sense in the local context. And so that is one of the key reasons that we felt in India and Indonesia specifically of why this was a good fit for us.
So I know that the very large majority of all marine debris, including plastic debris in the ocean, originates on land, but there is still some, right, that is ship-based. And when it comes to plastic, one particularly egregious type of plastic pollution comes from lost and abandoned fishing gear. And I don't know whether this partnership is going to try to focus on that aspect of the problem. For those of us who work on fisheries issues, it's particular problem because often this type of gear continues to kill marine organisms even with no benefit to people. Is there space in this partnership to take a look at that aspect of the problem? Don't know who I'm asking.
Well, I think we were pretty clear that like our focus has been trying to be on that land-based source. I do see, similar some parallels here around our. One of the strategies we're trying to focus on is building market value. We heard from some of the other panelists around there's a value to this resource, and the more value that's there, the more incentives that are put through the system to collect, sort, process, bring that material back. And so there's a similar kind of approach in a coastal community that says, how do you create more value to that abandoned fishing gear so that you can incentivize people within that value chain to bring it back and use it as a resource in that community for whatever is possible there. And there are people working on that. That's where sort of the land and sea kind of conversations, I think, can really come together because we are talking about coastal cities. The people who live there are fishermen.
Yes.
And they're all part of the same ecosystem. So they do come together at really critical junctures. I'd love to see an investment like that.
Yeah.
Emily, I think you're well positioned to talk about the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, which just came into the Ocean Conservancy.
Yeah, sure. So we run, thank you, Steve. We run, Ocean Conservancy is the current sort of lead conservation partner in the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, which our colleagues at World Animal Protection actually started with FAO a number of years ago. Another collaborative space to bring people together across government, industry, and conservation interests to work on solutions. So lots of great work happening there. As you know, a lot of the interventions are with the fishermen and through the fishery managers around tracking and tagging and marking gear and implementing best practices.
That's right.
There is an interesting infrastructure element in addition to sort of the incentives and creating the values to make sure you're recovering material. In many places, there's a need for port reception facilities, for places for people to bring gear and dispose of it appropriately. And so I think it will be interesting to see as a lot of us are starting to step into the space of partnering more locally with cities. For some coastal cities, that may be an element that we need to look at as well.
Before I open up the panel to questions from you, both here and online, if it's possible for us to get questions from online, I did want to bring your attention to one other part of the world that may not be a main focus for you, but it is for me, and that is the Arctic region. Plastic is entering the Arctic Ocean now as never before, in part because the receding sea ice is allowing plastic to intrude into the Arctic Ocean before. It's also a difficult place to study the phenomenon. It's just hard to get there. It's expensive. And yet, attention is now shifting there. The group of 8 countries that have territory in the Arctic 25 years ago created the Arctic Council. Now Iceland is taking over the chair and has made this issue, plastic pollution in the Arctic Ocean, one of the centerpieces of the work of the Arctic Council over the next couple of years. Indeed, there's be a large conference in Reykjavik in spring 2020 focused on this. Perhaps some of you will be there. Some of you may be there as well. And to that end, the Wilson Center and the Harvard Kennedy School are doing a workshop to help prepare for this in Cambridge in the very end of the very end of October, excuse me. What can you say about the Arctic Ocean? Is it something we ought to be focused on, or is it so remote and such a small part of the overall problem that you feel like we need to keep focusing on developing countries and places where the problem is more acute? What do you think about the Arctic? Do you think about the Arctic?
We think a lot about the Arctic. So just quickly, I guess I would say, again, this comes back to the problem of we need to do everything everywhere, but we also have to start somewhere. And so I think some of it is great to see leadership from folks like Iceland and the Arctic Council on the part of the problem that they can address. From our perspective, the Arctic is home to an amazing diversity and sort of unique set of species. And from that perspective, we would say protecting those species, particularly in an area of the world that's experiencing so many other intense pressures from climate change and sort of changing conditions, it is a priority and is an important place to focus. And so we're thrilled to see the leadership from the Arctic Council arising on that issue.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Steve?
I would just suggest that certainly the Arctic is important, and it's an unfortunate example of a result of mismanaged waste. And perhaps it provides the historic record and could act as a measure of progress as we work on plastic in other regions. So I think it's fair to say that there's not a lot of plastic that emanates from the Arctic, but unfortunately it ends up there.
Yeah.
So I would suggest if we make good enough progress over time, we should see good results there as well.
Okay. I think it's time now to turn to you. Both those in the room, I also have at least one question that's come in from an overflow group. But the floor is open. I'm going to take, say, 2 to 3 questions at a time and then see who wishes to answer, and then we'll come back and get another couple of questions. We have some roving microphones, right? I see a gentleman in the white shirt over here. Can we give him a microphone first, please?
I probably don't need a microphone.
Well, for the people listening online, it's really helpful.
Okay. Well, Brian Steert from Tetra Tech. Colleagues and I were in Vietnam 2 weeks ago for the Asian Conference on Marine Debris. And we were talking to the ambassador to Vietnam, who indicated there was a brand new recycling facility in Saigon, and it was getting no material. And I asked him, I said, well, did they do their homework and meet, with the local pickers and all of the people that are currently doing that work in order to make them partners in this endeavor, and they hadn't. And so I just wanted Rob to make sure when he's looking at these investments that, if you don't get the people that are doing the little bit they're doing now involved, they can make a big difference in not letting your system work.
Okay. Hold that thought, Rob. Yes, and all the way in the back. Gentleman on the aisle. Yes, go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you for having this conference. My name is Adam Alexander, Precision Energy Services and Plastics to Energy Systems. I was in Manila last month meeting with ADB, and I'm going back there next week. Yesterday, I was at a conference for waste conversion technology. That's something we've been doing for decades. And I'm glad to see Procter Gamble here in Dow. And we've been taking care of your plastics and certainly DuPont and AGFA and GE for many years in destroying that using a fluid bed. And September, we decided to try and make that a portable system and scale it to the Asian market, if you will. And we've also met with the Coast Guard officials in the Philippines who say they can mobilize these systems that we're talking about. But my question really comes down to where can essentially a small engineering company here in the U.S., where can we engage in these kinds of discussions with you? The second part of it is the notion of an economic model to monetize the value of plastics. If, using an example of the Philippines, they have 1 million metric tons per year of plastic that is imported, produced as a resin, or internally produced. And if you attribute a 10-cent life cycle value to that plastic, you have a slush fund of $220 million that can flow through the national, the local, and the barrio and the barangay levels and fund a lot of these recycling efforts. So just something for discussion. That economic model, I think, is the key to getting people to go and pick it. What's the right value for it? When you find people hijacking loads of garbage, you've got the right value.
Okay. Thank you for that. Well, we've heard from two people who've recently been in South Asia talking about these. Reactions to either of the points that have been made? Yes, Rob.
Yeah, so when we think about investing, and I think this is a kind of an important part of how people who are trying to solve this problem should be thinking about it, is any given investment or intervention exists within a waste shed. It centers around population. Waste is generated by people and consumption. So generally it's around people and where that population center is, but it's also limited by geography. Similar to how a watershed exists. A waste shed, you can only transport waste so long before you start extracting all the value from the cost of that logistics. So any given investment, you need to be thinking about where is that feedstock coming from, right? Who's collecting it? Who's sorting it? How is it getting to my facility, my recycling facility? And then how far can I ship my output to a local manufacturer or something of someone who's willing to pay for it? And so that is a really critical part of how this infrastructure needs to be built, is thinking about that entire waste shed and all of the players within it, not just any given intervention in its exclusivity. And then, I think the second question, just to build on that point a little bit, it ties to, the connection between the technology development in the developed world and the deployment in the emerging economies that we're talking about. And, that's really hard to do. Yeah. There's a lot of failures along that road. And I guess sort of the advice I would give down that path is don't try to do it from the U.S. Think about who those local partners are. Who's going to operate that thing? This is not running a conveyor belt, right? Some of these technologies, as we develop them, are pretty technically difficult to manage, and they need to be optimized and applied in a local context. So how does that operations work, and who will be those partners to make sure it's successful? Okay.
Haley or Steve, did you have any thoughts in response to the second question that came our way?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. First, I want to recognize the help that you're providing to us with your plastic solutions, Adam. Thank you very much. You had asked the question, where can you engage on this a little bit further? There's a fellow to my right by the name of Rob Kaplan. and Rob is assessing different investment opportunities. I'm also going to take an opportunity to talk about another collaborative, the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. It is just one of a plethora of opportunities that we work together with that are threaded amongst many of us here at this table, and they're also looking at investment opportunities. However, let me just address waste to energy or waste to fuel, more importantly in the larger context of the waste management hierarchy. And so we use that to help guide our decisions. And if you're familiar with the waste management hierarchy, which is generally accepted by most countries in the world, it's viewed by the EPA as a good model. It's viewed by the European Commission as a good model. And it essentially talks about the environmental impact of different end-of-life solutions, starting with the least impactful being reduce or avoid, followed by reuse models, and then recycling, and then energy recovery or conversion to fuel. and those being better than landfill. What's missing is litter. And so the first thing we need to do is make sure that we capture the material and make a choice where it goes. And then the second is to work through these to get as high up that waste management hierarchy as possible. Certainly solutions such as energy recovery or waste to fuel are important. I'd view those as bridging solutions until we can find better homes as we work our way up that waste management hierarchy. So I just wanted to share that perspective.
Okay, thanks for that. So we have a group of people who are not in this room. We're in an overflow room, and I have some questions from them. They're trying to package them in some way, but I'm just instead going to ask three sort of randomly because I can read the handwriting most easily. So particularly for Haley and Steve, can you differentiate between packaging and materials that are recyclable versus biodegradable and compostable? I think we were talking a little bit about that earlier, but maybe you have some more to say about that. Is there an interest in moving toward compostable packaging and plastic replacements? Yeah, I know we touched on that before. If you have anything more to add, I'd appreciate it. I asked a question earlier about the other players in this space, and here's yet another player in this space. I wonder if people have any thoughts about this player. The Alliance to End Plastic Waste, large group. I certainly have heard of them. Are they a potential partner in this endeavor, or are they sort of operating in parallel, I guess is the question. And then the final question, yes, we're focusing on the problem primarily in developing countries, but what about our own waste management system here in the United States? What is the role of the U.S. and American companies in eliminating plastic waste, including waste that comes from here and goes to Asia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You want to start?
Yep.
Who's brave?
There was a lot of questions.
Yeah,
I
in there,
realize.
so-
A lot of smart people on this panel, though.
Absolutely. Thank you. So first of all, going to the beginning of
Yes.
your question, I think with regards to compostability, we also have to look at the infrastructure that exists to be able to compost.
Yes.
And so all of this goes back to material choices, infrastructure to be able to manage the material and ultimately be able to infinitely recycle that.
Yeah.
So those choices, constantly play out. The other piece is I do think policy is absolutely going to be needed in order to gain the collection piece. I think a lot of places, like Steve mentioned, you've got to keep moving it up on the waste hierarchy curve, and you've got to make sure that there's a value and that it actually is being collected. That really is the first area that we're going. And maybe then pivoting to the second question on the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. We're both companies that are part of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, and it is a partnership also with Circulate Capital. So these are all combined efforts to make sure that we are really addressing the solution with solvable solutions. And that's the key, is the focus is on solutions to solve this.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Yes?
Let me build on that a little bit. I think one of the questions was, is biodegradable an answer? And I think if we look at the waste management hierarchy and ask the question, where will it end up? Biodegradable at best has two uses. One, the first time that you use it, and I'm talking about biodegradable plastics. But let's also think of paper. Paper is biodegradable, right? One of the interesting things that consumers not only tell us but show us by their action is, if we would market something as biodegradable, the opportunity for littering increases. It tends to make you not think about it. Yeah. We prefer to have people look at this material as having value and disposing of it properly in a recovery system where we can get a second, third, or fourth life. And the higher you go up on the waste management hierarchy, the more times you can reuse this material. Now, in certain areas, biodegradable could be a very good thing. It could be a bridging solution until infrastructure is in place. Mm-hmm. But we need to balance that with consumer behavior such that we're not suggesting litter is okay.
Can I amplify that just one piece? I think there are there's sort of an underlying assumption when I get asked that question about
Yeah.
biodegradability that like if it's degraded and it's back in its natural form, it's okay to put it into the environment. It's okay to put it into the ocean. I think if you think about carbon dioxide is a natural, element, is a natural chemical. We're putting way too much of it into the atmosphere and into the ocean. It's having devastating impacts. So we need to stop thinking of our environment as sort of like the ultimate sink. Right, and I think that's sort of the theory behind the idea that you're hearing from Haley and Steve around a circular economy and sort of recovering and reusing that material.
Okay.
That just because it's natural doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact.
So I've heard reactions to 2 of the 3 questions, but not the third, and that has to do with our own waste management system here in the United States, and do we have ways to improve it that would matter? And in particular, what about waste that we export, plastic waste that we export? What do we think about this?
Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Rob. What a lot of you don't know is we work together very frequently.
I'm picking up on that, yes.
That's a good thing, right? Specific to our own systems here, I want to point out a fund called the Closed Loop Fund and Closed Loop Partners, which really demonstrates the theory of catalytic capital here in North America. And so to bring this to life, there's about $50 million that's been invested in North America at below market rates or 0%. That has unlocked an additional $150 million, so $200 million, proving an investable runway. That particular model here gave way to the creation of Circulate Capital in South and Southeast Asia. So we have not forgotten about North America. We've not forgotten about Europe. We've not forgotten about the developed countries. We need to do all of this as well as amp up our efforts in South and Southeast Asia.
Okay, other thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just add on the developed world side, a lot of this challenge that we're facing in Southeast Asia is because of emerging economies looking towards the West and saying we deserve the same level of consumption, we deserve the same products and quality of life and services that the U.S. and Europe have enjoyed for many decades. And, they are modeling that and looking for that. And that is driven by how our consumers in this country and the behaviors that we take as consumers demonstrate. And so there's a huge opportunity there and also a lot of challenges in consumer behavior and engagement. And then on the export side, this one is a really interesting question.
Yeah.
It's incredibly dynamic. China changed its trade policy to prevent imports.
Just recently.
Just in the last couple of years, and that has wreaked havoc on waste and recycling in the U.S. It's largely because we were over-reliant on export markets and allowing ourselves to say, well, we don't need to invest in domestic processing and infrastructure because we can just export it in empty containers going somewhere else. That's also true in Indonesia. Much of the plastic that was captured there was also going to China for processing and sorting because there was kind of a unlimited appetite for that until the borders closed. That is a very dynamic space and will continue to evolve as many countries are saying, well, we no longer want to accept that waste. I will say for this audience and sort of in the international development conversation, Africa is the next frontier for this. And how will we think about trade in that context and their ability to handle imports? We already see that in electronics at a very staggering and scary scale. We see it in apparel as well, plastics and waste and other packaging. As infrastructure is built and domestic processing capacity is built, and countries start saying, well, I can handle my own waste, I don't want yours. It will continue to travel. And that's up to developed world to say, we're going to start processing it domestically.
Okay, I want to offer just a couple more opportunities for people here in this room to ask questions.
Oh.
Yes, a woman in the fourth row there, yes?
Thank you so much for this inspiring conversation. I'm Holly. I'm a sustainable finance consultant. I work with World Bank, IFC, and others. So what gets measured gets reported. So I'm wondering, and this is apparently a good example of a potential impact investment. So how are you going to measure success, especially for key indicators other than financial factors? Thank you.
Okay, and maybe one more. I see a woman in the next row. In the middle, yes? Please.
Hi, my name's Piper Campbell. I have a comment and then a question. The comment is, up until December of last year, I was the ambassador leading the U.S. mission to ASEAN, and I think it's worth noting that in November last year, the ASEAN countries passed a resolution identifying plastic debris, and specifically ocean plastic debris, as a national priority, a security issue, and that was endorsed in the East Asia Summit. So it's not only an ASEAN consensus, an agreement among those 10 states, but an agreement of those states and their 7 partners, including the U.S., China, Russia, that this is an important issue. So we have a foundation for work at the government level. The question has nothing to do with that. The question's more based on years of living in Southeast Asia, and an observation that so much of the use, especially of single-use water bottles, is based either on a lack of water infrastructure or a lack of confidence in the quality, the safety of the water infrastructure. And so the question is, you've mentioned a bit the goal to reduce waste within this initiative, but is there a focus within the initiative on supplying water in other ways so that single-use water bottles are not relied upon so heavily?
Okay, so we have a question about how do we measure success? And a second question about reducing the use of single-use plastic in carrying water by actually providing better water infrastructure that people could have confidence in. What do we think about that?
Could I just offer a comment on your comment about ASEAN? And just, I think it is wonderful that the private sector and the U.S. government are engaging and offering support and assistance. I think it is really important to recognize that there's tremendous leadership coming from within the region itself, not just through ASEAN, but through the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. And then, frankly, we're aware of a rich diversity of local groups in many of these countries who have been working to promote zero-waste cities and all sorts of projects on the ground. There's no way any of these efforts would be successful if it weren't for a lot of the great work happening in the region itself. To the point about how do we measure success, thank you for asking that. I think that is, I'm curious to hear how my colleagues are going to say this, discuss that. I think as a movement, right, as a collection of actors, you had asked about how do you form partnerships, how do you create synergies. I think right now our lack of ability to really measure the amount of plastic going into the ocean on a global scale and in a meaningful way is really inhibiting our ability to prioritize solutions, to find new collaborations. Again, Jambeck paper came out 4 years ago. It was a pretty, first cut estimate at how much plastic is going into the ocean. Just the power of that number alone has unleashed so much engagement and activity. But I think it would be wonderful if we could get more advanced in terms of the way we track progress.
I'd like to hear just a reaction to the second question we got about improving water infrastructure as a way to reduce single-use plastics carrying water bottles. Please,
Okay.
Carrie.
As the ambassador probably knows, that USAID has a major water program, and based on the 2014 Water for the World Act and the U.S. government water strategies, we work hard on water and sanitation around the world, and millions of dollars are spent on bringing better drinking water through improved infrastructure to communities around the world. The problem is so large, the challenge is so large, we don't get everywhere. But certainly that is something that USAID is doing. We certainly recognize the problem. And it's probably the gaps where we can't address the problem through proper water and sanitation infrastructure that single-use plastics become the solution.
Thank you. Please.
And I was
Ellie.
only going to add on to that.
Please.
And then the point is to make sure that they're not used just once, that we
Yes.
can infinitely recycle
Yes.
them and capture them and get them back and put them back into the circular economy. And if you can build off of both of those things, you
You'd
actually
actually
can
get
make a
somewhere.
dent in the solution.
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay, Steve.
I just want to contribute one thing, and that is individually as Procter & Gamble, we have a program we call it the Children's Safe Drinking Water Program. And we work in undeveloped regions to help them with purifying techniques, particularly these areas where you collect water from the river in buckets and need to clean it and And so we offer that as a solution, and we're proud to say that we've been participating in that for years, and that we have over 1 billion liters that have been cleaned to date, and we continue to do that. But specific to your question, I think it's one that we need to wrestle with. We haven't given that specific thought. It's a fair one, and I think we need to put it on the plate for some discussion.
Okay. I have the feeling we've just scratched the surface and could go on at great length, but we have come to the end of this segment of our event this morning. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists. And I think I'd like to invite the panelists to take their seats back in the front row. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my distinct pleasure to introduce to you someone I have long admired. He has represented with distinction his ocean state of Rhode Island in the United States Senate. He has been a tireless champion of legislation, of treaties, some of which I've negotiated, and other initiatives to advance ocean conservation. He is a founding member of the Senate Ocean Caucus, and in a time when our political institutions face, I would say, particularly difficult challenges in producing solutions for the common good, he has found ways to overcome those challenges time and time again. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse.
Thank you, Ambassador. It is wonderful to be here. I was able to catch the end of the terrific panel, and I appreciate very much the great work of all the panelists. I have two jobs here today. One is to say thank you. So particular thank you to the Wilson Center for stepping up to assert leadership in this area and help use its organizational cred to push progress forward in this area. Thank you to Circulate Capital and the companies that back Circulate Capital. It's really terrific when the private sector comes together and organizes in a way that makes it convenient and effective for government to work with you towards common goals. And so I'm really appreciative that Circulate Capital exists and is dedicated to this task. I want to thank also USAID. As we know from the nature of the plastics problem, 90% of it comes into our oceans through 10 rivers, and all 10 of them are in Asia and Africa, and 50% of it comes through 5 countries in Asia. And what seems to be the underlying problem is a catastrophic failure of upland waste management infrastructure. And that's something that USAID is well positioned as a government agency to do something about. I will also add that I'm the son, grandson, nephew, and first cousin of Foreign Service officers. I spent my life growing up around USAID folks and admire immensely the work you do in difficult, in some cases not so difficult places, but often in difficult places around the world, bringing a lot of American goodwill and expertise. And finally, I also want to thank Ocean Conservancy, which has done such leadership work on the science in this and is an important part of this conversation. I see Emily here from Ocean Conservancy. So that's one part. Thanks are done. Now comes the second part, which is, believe it or not, as bad as the signals are, my favorite recent scientific quote is from a scientist responding to the massive puffin die-off. Never thought I'd have to use that phrase, but here we are, saying that the oceans are screaming. And indeed, the oceans are screaming. And for those of us who will listen, the signs are really incredibly dire, from ocean acidification to ocean warming to pollution to overfishing, and of course to the proliferation of ocean plastic and the extent to which it's working our way through into our diets. You may be an upland, landlocked American, but it still affects you. A study in Colorado just showed that microscopic plastic particles come down in your rain in Colorado, very likely drawn up out of ocean water, which is where so much of our rain comes from to begin with. So we all understand the seriousness of the problem. What I want to say is that we're making some real progress in a bipartisan way in the Senate and in the House, in Congress, to get stuff done on this. And I'll tell you the story of Save Our Seas because it's an interesting window into the possibilities here. Save Our Seas is the first time that anybody in the Congress had tried to legislate in the marine plastic debris area. And obviously there are a lot of people in Congress who are suspicious of extending federal power and interest into any new area. But this was serious enough that we were able to go forward. My compadre in this battle was Dan Sullivan of Alaska. In Rhode Island, we do our annual beach cleanups with trash bags. In Alaska, they have to do beach cleanups with front-end loaders and dumpsters and barges because they're on the Pacific and they're an enormous coastal strainer. And so for Alaska, it's really a problem of a different scale than we are used to on the East Coast. So Dan became a really terrific partner. And the first thing we had to do was get a hearing together. And Commerce and EPW have always fought with each other for jurisdiction in this space. And I know this is a little bit nerdy, but turf is a big deal in my little world. So Dan, as the chairman of a subcommittee on EPW, had to negotiate with the relevant Commerce Fisheries Committee chairman in order to make sure that we could hold our hearing in EPW. Fortunately, the Commerce Fisheries chairman was Dan Sullivan. So Dan and Dan went out into the hallway, they had a conversation, they came back, and we had our hearing. With the hearing, we brought some really wonderful witnesses together who had very common views about what needed to be done. And bit by bit, colleagues strolled into the Environment and Public Works Committee to participate in the hearing. And in a committee that very often is harshly divided on environmental issues, as the hearing went forward, it became increasingly apparent that there was bipartisan, unanimous support for moving forward on this, that this was an important issue to people. And then Jim Inhofe showed up, my colleague from Oklahoma, who I have raging battles with about climate change and other things. And inside my head, I said to myself, how is this possible? He's from Oklahoma. He doesn't even have a coast. Why is he coming to ruin our day? This is a story about prejudgment. Because as it turns out, Senator Inhofe, as a young man, would go down to the Gulf Coast of Texas and described in the hearing, when it came his time, spending the night on the Texas Gulf Coast shore with his flashlight and his folding chair, waving away vehicles that were traversing the beach so that they wouldn't run over the little baby sea turtles coming out of their shells and going down to the Gulf. And at the end of the hearing, he said, you know what? I really like this bill. I like this idea. When you get your bill done and it's finalized, put me on as an original co-sponsor. And I will tell you that when a bill comes to the Senate floor with Sheldon Whitehouse and Jim Inhofe on it, there's a lot of room for everybody else in the middle. And the result was that we got the bill passed by unanimous consent. Now, it wasn't the biggest bill in the world. This is coming up on the anniversary of Normandy. It was a beachhead. But Dan had such a good time doing it that he came to me immediately and said, let's do a bigger, better bill. And with that, SOS 2.0 began, and we will be announcing it very shortly. We're in final drafting stages, and we're looking forward to working it through the same process, through the Oceans Caucus in the Senate, and then through the relevant committees, so that we can get the bill to the floor in a way where it too will pass by unanimous consent. It is much more ambitious, and it's a good sign that the world came back to Dan and I in a very positive way, so that we felt the support where he could instantly say, let's do this and do a bigger, better bill. One other thing I want to add about Senator Sullivan. He spent time in previous Republican executive administrations and knows his way around the White House And he's spent a great deal of effort going to the Office of the Trade Representative, to the Commerce Department, into the White House itself, arguing for more pressure and more interest on this in our international engagements and in our trade engagements. So in addition to being a terrific colleague on this bill, in addition to being an enthusiastic booster of a bigger, better bill, he also really dedicated an enormous amount of his personal effort to moving the executive branch along. So there's a lot of possibility here. We have other bills coming out through the Senate Bipartisan Oceans Caucus. We've gotten treaties passed unanimously. We've gotten port states measures legislation passed unanimously. We've got the plastics bill passed unanimously. We've got a blue globe bill that's out there already I encourage you to take a look at that we hope will pass unanimously. And we've got SOS 2.0 we're dropping shortly. We are churning through increasingly important oceans legislation in the Senate, not just in a bipartisan way, in a unanimous way. So load us up, put us to work, and let's get this solved. Thank you.
Well, I don't know about you, but that's a really good way to end the program. Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. And as an Alaskan, I take honor in the fact that Senator Sullivan has led that effort with Senator Whitehouse and many of the colleagues. In Alaska, we like talking about how big our state is. We often joke with our Texas friends and Oklahomans that we can take a couple of their states and put them within our state and everything is bigger. They have some rhetorical comments which I won't share with you. But on the issue of cleanup, we do not take pride in the fact that indeed we do have to have bulldozers and barges to take up the challenge of cleaning our coasts from the very issues we talked about today. So I want to thank Senator Whitehouse for taking time out of a very, very busy schedule today to be with us. Also want to thank a distinguished panel and Dave, your leadership. I came to today thinking this is yet one more giant issue that Woodrow Wilson Center simply must be involved in. I'm not quite sure how to advance it. I will tell you that I think I have several ideas on how we can help partners and friends. But I'm left with some hope here, and the fact that industry, private sector, civil service have come together, and that's a really good place to be. And so we will explore, hopefully, with our panelists, with you in the audience, those online. And I want to thank those online and those who are in the museum on floor 1 of the Reagan building, because we simply could not fit them in here for enduring the museum. So aside from 130 or so people here and 100 plus online and the many in the museum, thank you for being a part of today. But I'm encouraged by the fact that we actually have some solution sets. There might be models out there for investment and return on investment, and the fact that we understand that this is a global problem concerning global citizens, and we all have to take a part in that. The figure now is how we address it, but I think we have some very good ideas. As always, there are people you must thank for making a day like this possible. So I thanked our panel, Dave Balton's leadership, Senator Whitehouse, but Lauren Reese, who many of you know, who leads our environmental change and security program. Without Lauren's leadership, we simply do not have these events. Lauren, thank you. And Amanda King, who makes everything possible here on that front. Amanda, thank you as well. Casey Breitenbeck, who you will not know, but Casey makes sure things like this occur behind the scenes. And so I want to thank Casey, because as you know, when I show up to places, people make things happen, and you simply don't know that they've done it. They have done it. So I want to thank Casey as well. So I think today we have a list of issues that we have explored. I would hope that there's a way that the Woodrow Wilson Center and our colleagues in this town can help advance these issues, not just in this place, but overseas as well. So if you have very good ideas within reason about how we can help this effort, please let us know. And last but not least, we're often confronted with these conflicting dark and white, and never the two shall meet. And I think the fact that Senator Whitehouse and Senator Sullivan with their colleagues have come together on this issue gives me hope for many other issues facing our planet. I fear that our ocean planet at times now should be called our plastics planet, and I do not want that to happen. So simply let me end by saying, with all of your help, please help the Wilson Center figure out ways in which we can make our ocean planet the ocean planet and not the plastics planet. So thank you all for this day, and I look forward to the next time we get together. Thank you again.